Hi, today's video is going to be about some general ideas in philosophy. This is inspired by and may touch on some of the things happening in my Scrabble story, but also by current political events in the world and the type of factionalism and divisiveness we have. And I'm going to sort of jump between a few different ideas, but I think, as you'll hopefully see, that they're all sort of interrelated and different ways of exploring sort of the same thing from different angles. But I actually want to start by talking about the Myers-Briggs personality test, and specifically the T versus F scale within that test, thinking versus feeling. So you can read a lot of the basics about the Myers-Briggs personality test online if you're not familiar with it already. And I want to be very clear from the outset that, in my opinion, it is pseudoscience. It is something that I think is a kind of useful tool for thinking about the world and gives us some good language to talk about ideas of different personalities and perceptions of the world and how we interact with it. But I'm not saying that it's completely valid from a scientific point of view or anything like that. I just like using the language of it to explore these ideas. But specifically, the thinking, feeling part of it is, to give a quick synopsis, thinkers make decisions based on logic, facts, and objective criteria, prioritizing consistency and impersonal principles. In contrast, feelers make decisions based on personal values, empathy, and how outcomes affect others, prioritizing harmony and subjective considerations. So, I bring this up really because I believe that a lot of the conflict that I've gotten into with certain people in the Scrabble world who don't want to make it possible for me to get back into Scrabble fairly is coming with people who are extreme feelers, who are very strong on the feeling side of the spectrum and perceive the world more that way than on the thinking side of the spectrum. And you might think, based on a lot of things I've already said and argued for, that I am a pretty strong thinker. I am someone who cares a lot about objectivity and consistency and ideas of justice and things like that. And while that is true, I do feel like that has to be tempered somewhat, because when I took the Myers-Briggs personality test, which I've done a number of times and achieved pretty consistent results on, so I feel like it is probably a relatively good measure of myself. I actually found that the thinking feeling scale was the one that I was most in the middle on. I did veer very closely, or very slightly to the thinking side, but my feeling side was very strong too. And it was actually my weakest preference of all my different scales on the Myers-Briggs test. And I think it's an important thing to remember is that all of these scales in the Myers-Briggs test are spectra. And people tend to lean more one way than the other, but that can change over time, and it doesn't mean that they're always consistently one way or the other. And I'll even go a step further and say that I think that perceiving the world accurately, perceiving the world well, is really about being able to see both sides of this. And I think that if someone is too strongly toward one side or the other and ignores the reality of their side, they are kind of blinding themselves to a lot of what's happening in terms of human interaction. So I consider myself, slightly a thinker, but still a very strong feeler. And I might even argue that in my earlier days, when I was studying mathematics and things like that in school, I veered more heavily toward the thinking side. But when I started teaching at a school, I had to really strengthen my feeling side. I had to recognize that harmony is very important in a classroom, and that if you're in a classroom with 20 students and one teacher, for instance, you've got 21 different perspectives on what's happening at any given time. And you have to be able to sort of mediate between those different perspectives and see how the impacts of particular things that can happen affect a lot of people very differently depending on their own emotional overlay. So I very much understand and relate to the side of a lot of feelers on a lot of this stuff. But I do feel like I have made a particular decision in my life. I want to be clear about this. I feel like this is not just a preference, it is a moral decision that I made, that when the thinking and feeling sides are in conflict with each other, and they're not always. There are times where you can tap into both the thinking and feeling side, and they can both be very helpful for solving certain problems, for working certain situations out. But when they are in conflict with each other, I believe that the thinking side has to win 100% of the time. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that is very much the essence of morality. Is the idea that we are all emotional creatures and get caught up in our feelings and our emotional perspectives sometimes, but really putting ourselves above the animals, making ourselves more human, is about allowing our rational side to override our emotions and to make decisions that we know are objectively best, regardless of the emotional take we might have on these things. And I think I've said before in another video too that this is very much related to this idea of justice versus frontier justice. And there was a great speech about that I quoted in the description of one of my other YouTube videos from The Hateful Eight by the Hangman, and that. And it's not just that particular quote. There are many other quotes in the history of our justice systems, our legal systems, not only here in the US, but in many other countries, where we really sort of live by the idea that justice means looking at the facts objectively, putting emotions aside. So I do believe that we have a sort of moral obligation as humans when we have to mediate between thinking and feeling. That thinking has to win to really get past our animal selves, to live in the world fairly and justly. And to me, this is actually also very related to an important philosophical term, the tyranny of the majority. And this is a term now that has a long history in philosophy and political philosophy in particular. And it's actually not entirely known. Like the idea was around in a lot of older writings, but not necessarily phrased in that exact way. From what I've been able to find, the first time that it was ever actually used in that way, the tyranny of the majority, was by John Adams, the second president of the United States, in 1788. And interestingly, this is a year before the Bill of Rights was actually written. That was written in 1789. And I think that's an important thing to note, because I think the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution is actually maybe the most important part of our government, our founding documents of our government, in terms of protecting ourselves from this idea of the tyranny of the majority. But John Adams mentioned this term once, and it was used in writing by a few other people at various times, but it didn't really enter the lexicon of philosophy until 1840, when Alexis de Tocqueville, a French philosopher, wrote about it in part 2 of his book, Democracy in America. So, as might be clear from that book title, even though Alexis de Tocqueville was a French philosopher, he was very intentionally writing about the US system of government and doing a detailed analysis of it and what worked and didn't work for it and what some of the philosophical ideas were behind it. And he's really the one responsible for sort of introducing that term into the philosophical lexicon. But the person who really popularized it after him was an English philosopher, John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty from 1859, or Essay on Liberty in 1859. So that's kind of the guys who brought this term into the lexicon. But I think it's really important to think about what this means, this idea of the tyranny of the majority. The idea is that when we are using a majority vote system, when we're doing some sort of democratic processes, we are often, in a way, sort of striving for harmony. We're striving for, what is the solution? Who are the people who should be in charge that are most accepted by the greatest number of people, who can bring us together and create a harmonious society or make our society more harmonious. But one of the things that these writers were writing about, and as I said, John Stuart Mill is really the one I think who harped on this the most, is this idea that seeking after this kind of harmony can come at the risk of danger to individuals or smaller marginalized groups. And this is exactly why we needed to build the Bill of Rights into our constitutional system. It was not originally part of the Constitution. It was added shortly afterwards when a lot of our founding fathers felt it was an important piece that was missing from the Constitution, because it was recognized that if you have just a completely democratic society where majority rules, that you can very easily stomp on individual liberties. And there's an idea that even though we want, to a certain extent, to have democracy, we also want to have the idea of individual rights that cannot be infringed upon. So I think this is a really important thing, this idea of there being individual rights, the idea of there being protection for individuals or for marginalized groups and all of this is really a thinking idea, not a feeling idea, right? This is the idea that the masses can get swept up in emotions and end up not really, taking into account their impact, their actions on some small minority of people. And they need to sort of set ground rules for themselves in terms of what their limitations are to make sure that they are not stepping on the toes of these individuals through this emotionality. We need this objective framework to protect individuals and minorities. I think this also relates to another term that I've talked about before, which is this idea of moral absolutism or objectivism, or another one I've heard recently is moral universalism. And I will tell you that I've read a little bit about each of these terms, and I don't really have them straight enough in my head yet to say which one of them I would really prefer as a label here. But they're all kind of centered around the same idea. When you're talking about moral universalism, objectivism, or absolutism, it's kind of the opposite of moral relativism. It's the idea that there are objective truths in the area of ethics in terms of what's right and wrong that transcend any culture, any individual context. And one sort of thought experiment I like to think about when we're talking about this kind of moral rejection of moral relativism, let's say, is to think about, let's say we're having a conversation between two different people, and there are no other witnesses there. It's just the two of them having a conversation, and this conversation is later remembered by them, maybe recounted in court or something like that, or there was some later dispute or argument about what was said and how it impacted these people. And it's very important, I think, the sort of feeling side of this to recognize that there are two different sides to every story, right? There was what was perceived or felt by one person, and there was what was perceived or felt by the other person. And those might be very different from each other, even though they were both participating in the same conversation. They might have heard it a different way. They might have remembered it a different way. They might have felt different things. And often when you're trying to create harmony, when you're trying to resolve conflicts between people, a lot of what you're trying to do is to bridge that gap, to figure out what were the different perspectives of each of these people, and understanding the different perspective this other person had and that you had can actually be a secret to bridging that gap, to creating more peace between them. But I think it's really important to understand that when these two people have this conversation, there aren't really just two perspectives, there are three. So let's say, for instance, that this entire conversation was recorded on video or audio by a microphone or video camera. Then it is the case that there's the question of sort of one, what was perceived by one person, and two, what was perceived by the other person, but also three, what was captured by this objective recording device. And now not all conversations are captured that way. It might be that we don't have a way of doing that, but we can also say that as a sort of thought experiment here, even if that conversation wasn't recorded, there is the question of what a camera or a microphone would have picked up, right? There's a question of if you had a objective third-party listener that had absolutely no emotional overlay or bias whatsoever, what it would have seen in that particular circumstance, right? And I think this is a very important thing to understand in terms of there is a separate objective reality beyond the perception of these two people. And having that conversation recorded, seeing it again can actually provide more insight into what actually happened beyond what just happened from the point of view of each of the two individuals. And that's not to say that the entire truth is just captured by that objective camera. You could also say that, it might be that these two people had a conversation that had a lot of context to it. They had previous conversations or previous knowledge that was shared between them so that they knew when they were talking, they were referring to other things outside of that or building on other things that they already built an understanding about. And the camera by itself would not be enough to pick that up because it doesn't have the same context of their previous interactions, of their previous history and all of that. So I'm not just saying that the objective camera is the only part of reality here, but I'm saying that seeing things, getting the whole picture of things, in a way, is seeing from all of these different perspectives. And I think you can very much think of the first two perspectives, the perspectives of the individuals, as being the sort of feeling perspective, whereas the perspective captured by the camera is the thinking perspective, to use the Myers-Briggs terms, thinking and feeling, T versus F. All right, so that's a way that I think all of these things are connected to each other. And one way I like to think about this is that I am a person who cares a lot about objective reality. I have built most of my success in life as a mathematician, as a chess and Scrabble player, as a math teacher, really, trying to teach my students to think more objectively. I also used to teach standardized tests, so other thing, it's a very objective thing. And I feel like it's been probably my biggest passion in life, trying to get people to think more objectively. And I do think that getting ourselves to see that objective part of things is very important for us developing our own morality, for us becoming better humans and building a better society. And I often think of this actually using a little bit of mathematical terminology, is that, like, I know that I, just like everyone else, am a human with limits to my own perception, with my own personal biases, my own personal emotions that can kind of cloud my view of reality sometimes. But one thing that I really, really strive to do is to keep improving my own objective worldview iteratively and asymptotically. So what I mean by that, iteratively, it's a repeated process. Whenever I find I'm making errors, I keep on trying to correct that set of errors and make sure that I don't make those same errors the next time around, and that I am less likely to fall into those same mental traps and see things a little more objectively. And when I say asymptotically, what I mean is you can think of it sort of like Zeno's paradox, getting halfway there and then halfway there and halfway there and never quite getting there. The idea is that there is some objective reality, but all of our human brains, all of our human minds and perceptions and senses will never be able to perceive it absolutely perfectly. We'll never be able to get ourselves to a point of view of complete objectivity. However, I do think that we can strive and strive and strive to get closer and closer and closer by correcting our errors, by admitting our faults, by putting our egos and emotions aside, and try to get our perceptions more in line with that objective reality. And that is something I've striven to do a lot. I will tell you that one thing that is pretty bothersome to me is that the people who pushed me out of Scrabble and a lot of their friends who they got to hate me along the way have used the term that my blog was a manifesto, which I think is an absolutely ridiculous and inaccurate description of what it is. It is very much the case that when you talk about a manifesto, you're really talking about one person's opinion, their take on the world or on a particular issue that's just all about that point of view and nothing else. It is very much the case that when I started writing the blog in 2019 going into 2020 and ended up publishing those first two blog posts in July 2020, that I was very intentionally taking many people's perspectives into account. I had talked to many different people in my Scrabble community about events that happened and gotten their points of view about it. I'd also talked to many people outside of the Scrabble community about it to get their takes as well, and even showed people some of the writings of this so they could see some of the detail of what happened. But furthermore, it wasn't just about the sort of opinions about, who's in the right on the side of that argument. Just in terms of recalling a lot of the history of it. I am, as I mentioned before, something of an archivist. I've saved a lot of emails and text messages and all that. And a big part of what I did when I first wrote that blog in 2020 was go back through a massive amount of the history of my text messages with Jennifer to help correct my own memory and make sure that I was thinking accurately about what had actually happened in the sequence of events, what order that happened in, and what both of our perspectives were at that time. Another thing is I've actually been keeping paper calendars going back like 15 years at least. And I was able to look back at a lot of those paper calendars where I wrote a lot of detail about what I did in different days to make sure that I had the chronology of things right. And it was very much the case when I first looked back at this. I realized that I remembered some things wrong. I had some errors in my memory and chronology of this, and I needed to correct that by looking at these contemporaneous sources and get myself closer and closer to that reality. Now, I also fully admit that although I did have a lot of help, I did have a lot of editorial support, I did have a lot of other people sort of looking over my shoulder and making sure what I was saying was more objective in the early going, especially in those first two blog posts in July 2020, but also with some of the blog posts that came after that, but also especially some of the early responses to the Scrabble associations from these accusations against me. I did have other people looking at this stuff too, to a certain degree, but it was also the case that gradually over time, as there was more and more abuse of me, and as the thing wore on more and more, and I became in a more traumatized place with my PTSD, I had less editorial support, I had fewer people helping me out, and you can definitely make a claim that I was, in a lot of these latter posts, not having as many guardrails and support from other people to help me make sure that I'm seeing everything objectively. And I fully admit that, but I also say, like, it was never through me not wanting it. I very often tried to show friends or other people some of my writings and get some feedback from them, even if I wasn't able to get a whole lot of help or guidance on things. But I will also say that, you know, despite the fact that I am a mortal, flawed human being, and I might have my own biases, I also feel like I've done a really, really good job relative to what most humans would do in my situation of looking at the situation objectively, of looking back at those objective sources, of correcting my own errors. And it's not to say that I'm perfectly objective, but I am probably quite a bit more objective about recounting the stuff than a lot of other people would be. And furthermore, if anything should be called a manifesto, I feel like it's really what these accusers wrote in their incident report against me in 2022. That very much was their myopic take on this situation based on not having seen me in years, not having any conversations to correct their point of view or to get anyone on the same page, and just having built this hateful myth of me and wanting to spew that myth far and wide, get other people to believe their point of view, not to believe in objective reality. So I'm really bothered by people thinking that I'm the one writing a manifesto when the people who destroyed my life were the ones who actually wrote a manifesto here. And I just want to be clear that, like, I do think that when people have been asking me for apologies, when they've been expecting some sort of contrition from me, it's because they are stuck in their own myopic emotional worldview, and they only want to hear things that supplement and back up that worldview and don't challenge that worldview. And they hear things that challenge that worldview as a threat to themselves. This is something that's often called the backfire effect. And quite simply, me putting my foot down and saying, I'm not giving you the contrition you want to hear. I'm only giving you contrition for things that I believe are objectively true. I'm not going to play a role of playing a guilty party when I'm actually not guilty. And if you think your need for that emotional support of your incorrect worldview gives you a right to interfere in my life, then we have a problem, right? I'm happy to work with you if you want to have good faith conversations with me and bridging the gaps between our perspectives. But you don't get to use your different and, quite frankly, inferior perspective because you're seeing things from such an emotional point of view and not an objective one as a way of interfering with my life. And that is what a huge number of people in the Scrabble community have done. I have been playing Scrabble tournaments for well over 20 years. I've been an important part of this community for a long time, but so many people got themselves so hateful toward me, so emotionally activated by the lies about me, that they thought their emotional perspectives, their feeling perspective rather than their thinking perspective, gave them a right to overstep boundaries and to interfere with my life. And that is where the solution is not for me to placate their emotions. It is for them to get over their emotions and start perceiving things more objectively in more of a thinking perspective rather than a feeling one.